Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another educational webinar from AgileQuest. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've seen a large increase in interest for flexible work programs to improve engagement and cut costs. The question everybody's asking when they call in is, how do we do hoteling right, or what must we do to make our telework program successful? To answer these questions for more than just our own customers, we've assembled a team today to share their experience and expertise in what makes a successful program. We have Kara Kavanaugh from Life Meets Work, a workplace flexibility consulting firm that provides training, content, and implementation support to help organizations make real culture changes so critical to program success. We also have Torrance Houlihan, the Vice President and Director of Product Management here at AgileQuest. He's the one responsible for the strategy that keeps our technology evolving so it meets the ever-changing needs of real-world mobile workers. And the group who performs the upfront analysis and surveys that launch these kinds of programs is led by Dave Sauty, our Director of Workplace Services. He's going to be moderating today's panel discussion. Now, they've created a very complete discussion, and we're going to do our best to deliver it in just 60 minutes, but we do have an almost complete hour of content here, so we'll still be taking questions at the end, but we may go to 2:10 or 2:15. Please stay with us if you can. So, we're going to be taking those questions using the WebEx Q&A facility, and just remember that you type in your question and queue them up during the presentation itself, and we'll answer them as soon as we're done with the panel discussion. With that said, we'll start the presentation with Dave Sauty, and take it away, Dave.
All right, great. Thanks, Doug. We put this webinar together because we're regularly receiving calls and inquiries for help, our expertise, and our experience. Some are just looking for some quick advice. Others are asking for a much more professional engagement. But the questions they're really asking are, how do we hotel successfully, and how can we make telework work for our organization? We've seen many organizations implement some form of flexible work. Some programs turn out great. Others struggle to take hold. A successful program can often reach their financial cost-cutting goals, but then also it's important that people are engaged and productive and see value from the program as well. Sometimes that's not always the case. So what makes these different programs different? Well, one program often succeeds when others don't. Well, in today's webinar, we've brought together the workplace training and communication experience from an organization called Life Meets Work and the services technology experience of AgileQuest to collect and reveal common critical elements of successful programs, and hopefully we've helped give you a roadmap to a successful program by the end of the webinar. We've broken these programs down into 6 distinct phases. Each one has unique elements. I will be moderating today, and I will be taking you through these phases and asking Kira and Torrance to explain important items and considerations at each phase. Doug, if we can move into planning. Torrance, why don't you start by taking us through some of the important parts of this phase?
Dave, thanks very much. The first one, as everybody can see there, is executive buy-in. And I know a lot of people might look at that and think, that's a no-brainer. Of course, we need to start there. But I want to take that a little bit deeper and talk about the fact that the executive buy-in has to be both visible and consistent throughout this program. You need to make sure that the leadership of your organization is supporting the change, willing to demonstrate the change, and drive it through the organization. If they have concerns or questions about the change that's going on, document them, address them, get them on your side, and get them visible so that people know that this is a real initiative, it has support from the top. And in fact, many of the organizations we work with, they even have their senior leadership, their partners, or their vice presidents involved in the mobility programs themselves. So all the way up to the top, these people are participating in telework and hoteling. The next point on executive buy-in that I just want to touch on is making sure that you maintain alignment between what we sometimes call the three-legged stool. If you get a visual in your head of a three-legged stool, if any one of those is out of alignment, then the stool itself isn't going to be balanced and isn't going to be functional. In our world, the 3 legs that we have are your HR team, your IT team, and your real estate team. And as changes are made in any one of those areas, you have to make sure that the other 2 areas are addressing them to keep things in alignment so that your workforce, your community can continue to be effective and productive through those changes?
This is Kira. I think one of the real challenges is that traditionally we have seen agile workplace, mobile workplace, flexibility, and virtual work programs initiated by either HR, IT, or real estate. And we really, Agile Quest and Like Things Work, really, and others, see the opportunity for organizations to work with those departments aligned and coordinated to really integrate workplace flexibility and virtual work into the entire organization. It just simply isn't enough anymore to be leading an initiative with an individual department's focus. And so that's why the third point that we really want to stress on executive buy-in is not only is the three-legged stool important, but it's also important to be integrating the perspectives and viewpoints and knowledge of many other departments in your organization. And we see best practice companies doing that by assembling a steering committee. One organization that we work with has 16 different people on a steering committee, which might sound overwhelming, but they break into subcommittees to handle specific tasks, and they're getting perspectives from parts of the organization like legal and communication that have input that they wouldn't be receiving otherwise.
Kira, you're right, and of course all of these groups that we're talking about, you and I, are aligned in support of the business case, and very often when we talk about the business case with organizations, they jump immediately to the bottom line. You know, what's the impact on this? What's the ROI? What's my payback period? How am I going to make my financial metrics work with this change? And that's important, absolutely, and I want to make sure people do understand that there are financial implications to these changes and huge financial benefits when you go down this path and introduce these programs in your organization. At the same time, I want to draw your attention to the second bullet, which is something that I sometimes call the personal ROI, and making sure that you understand what's in it for the people who are being impacted. We're changing now the way they go to work on a daily basis, and we need to be very aware of that change, how they're going to perceive it, and make sure that they understand what's in it for them. Organizations who get this, who understand that personal ROI, go on to use the impact of this change as an attraction and retention mechanism, because this demonstrates not only that you care about the individual and their work-life balance and you want to make sure that they're working in a place that supports them, but it also demonstrates that the organization is socially responsible and looking at its impact on the environment. When you introduce these programs, you cut your CO2 footprint, you cut your energy consumption, you reduce your requirement for commuting back and forth to work. There are lots of great benefits to these programs which can be wrapped up into that personal ROI to help get people to buy in and embrace that change.
Great. And on that third point, go ahead, Kira.
No, sorry about that.
Okay. You know, on that third point, you know, are you going to redesign and remodel that space? You know, when it comes to business case, you know, we all know that every project comes with constraints like, you know, time and budget. And we all want to make a point that, you know, a successful program is not predicated necessarily on building out a new space plan. You know, many organizations have implemented a successful program using their traditional space and just thinking about that space differently. Now that said, you know, an updated space plan design, taking into consideration, you know, an alternative work style, you know, more room for collaborative space, conference space, you know, the ability to integrate, you know, new tools and technologies into the space, fantastic thing, but I wanted to make sure that you understood it's not a requirement of the project and therefore not necessarily a requirement of a business plan.
Well, and interestingly, we're seeing more and more organizations running two separate initiatives depending on whether or not workplace redesign is part of the initial scope of the project. So organizations where they may have introduced a workplace flexibility or a virtual work program years ago but are looking to do something new are looking to real estate. So real estate starts an initiative to create and redefine the workspace, and then those programs never come back together and integrate back in because they're being led by separate functions. So it's really important to work together, HR, IT, real estate, and others, to define what does success look like for you and for your organization. Some of those success criteria may be quantitative, and some of them are going to be qualitative. What's interesting is if you sit down with all three parties at a table and ask, what does success look like to you, you're going to get very different answers. And so through the process of negotiating to come up with a set of success criteria, you're already aligning your mission and the scope of your initiative to be coordinated from the very beginning.
And Kira, the only thing I would add to that, I think that's exactly right. I would just make sure that people remember to baseline where they are today before they introduce the change, so that they have a metric that they can go back to and compare later on after the change has been introduced, so that they can understand if they've met those success criteria that you've talked about. And in doing that, of course, they have to decide, what are you going to measure, and when and how are you going to measure? Will your metrics be qualitative or quantitative or both? And how will you try to get them? You need to think about this early on. Are these going to be surveys? Are these going to be observation? Are these going to be data collected? Sometimes people may not even be aware of it because you're looking at card access into buildings and other things. So as you look at your success criteria, make sure you baseline it and you have a plan for gathering and measuring going forward.
And traditionally, organizations have valued or determined the success of their programs based on utilization, whether it's the number of flexible work requests or virtual work requests that have been entered into a system, or whether it's the utilization of the hoteling program, et cetera. And it's really important to realize that even employees who are not currently utilizing the mobility solutions that you're providing, it doesn't mean that they're not interested and that isn't still part of their employee value proposition. So we really encourage you to think about, what are the performance metrics? We actually have a slide we'll make available to you after the webinar with over 15 different bottom line metrics, improvements in the organization that have been proved out in the research over about 15 or 20 years. So things like customer retention, reduced work turnover and absenteeism. So be thinking more broadly than just utilization, and it'll help then go back to align that business case that we started with.
That's exactly right. The metrics go beyond just the utilization. Worker to workspace is one that we do traditionally look at with our customers, and it is something that can be measured over time, but there's more to it to understanding the big picture.
All right, great. Man, you know, the planning phase, as we all know, is about figuring out what's the right plan for your organization, making sure it's aligning with the organization's strategic goals, corporate-wide, making sure you got that buy-in top to bottom, you know, defining success, and then measuring to confirm success. You know, near and dear to my heart, good measurement and benchmarking, make sure that everyone on the team is accountable and aligned on the project. So, you know, as your organization now moves into the development phase, Torrance, you want to take that away?
Yeah, one of the first things that you'll do in the development phase of a successful program is to start thinking about the policies, procedures, and processes that need to be in place to support this. And we've talked about that three-legged stool, and so there have to be policies, procedures, and processes among those organizations, HR, IT, and real estate, to make sure that everyone knows what's expected of them. You know, for example, how often will people come into the office? How are you going to manage documents with a change like this? What about storage? Where do I keep my things? There may be new security issues as you move into a shared environment like this. So there are lots of questions that you need to think about and make sure that you lay this out so people understand very clearly what's going to be expected of them before you go into a change like this.
So many organizations start and stop their programs with the policies and the processes, whether it's policies around hoteling, whether it's policies around OSHA requirements at your home office. And so many times, especially our HR folks, really get caught up in the policies. One of the things that we're doing a lot of work with organizations on now, which is really something that has been a sticking point traditionally, has been in work process redesign. So if from the development phase of your initiative, you can start thinking about invoice processing, signing documents, document management and storage, thinking about what are the current processes that rely on being on site, and to start to include that in the development of your program, then you're going to enable the organization as a whole to take more advantage of mobility programs as a result. You also really want to think about aligning the tone of the policies that you put together with the culture and the branding of your organization. So if you tend to be a pretty strict policy organization, you're going to want your policy to reflect that, to be really tight and fairly prescriptive. Other organizations really know that when they launch a policy, there's sort of a recoiling of employees in the organization around, oh, here comes another policy. So some organizations choose to call them guidelines. It sounds like a minor point, but just that shift, again, can really go far in terms of getting the buy-in that you need to change the culture over time.
You're right. And one of the other areas that people have to think about to get started is they look at their space and they start wondering, how am I going to change in the space that I have? Is there a huge investment that is going to be necessary in order to get started? And the answer to the question simply is no, there isn't. You can get started in the space you have today to understand the change, how people will embrace the change, and how you can begin to move forward. As we've mentioned at the outset of this, when Dave had the initial chart up there, it was a linear picture, of course, but this isn't a linear process. This is an iterative process that you're going to continue through and learn and evolve and change. And if anyone on the webinar today was with us last month, our guest panelist brought up the point of you can absolutely begin this process without changing your space, but if you really want to drive it to its ultimate fulfillment, you will have to look at how your space plays a part in this. But don't look at what you have today as an inhibitor. You can get going with what you have today, and then you can move forward as you learn more.
That's great, Torrance. You're right. And I just want to, as someone who comes to this more from a facilities perspective, I often forget that a lot of this kind of program is all about people as well. It's important to remember that. So how do we get into their heads a little bit? Well, it's great to survey the workforce and management, gauge their cultural readiness for a change like this. Try to understand in advance what concerns different users might have. This is, for many people, this is something they've really been waiting for, and for other people, this is a real shift in sort of the way they work.
So when you're thinking about designing a change plan, that can be a really new piece of the puzzle for you, perhaps today, and as we're laying this out. We really encourage you to think about being very deliberate about how are you going to accomplish this culture change that's going to be critical to the success and the longevity of mobility and virtual work in your organization. We look at it in 3 separate phases. As you're thinking about the change plan, you want to think about communication. It's not just as simple as sending out an email saying, ta-da, we've got a new program, isn't it awesome? It actually needs to be a very concerted strategy over a number of years where you're building communication elements, communication materials, communication messages, and we'll get into talking about how that gets even more refined a couple of years into your program in a few minutes. But communication and being very deliberate about communication is going to be key. Also, another element to communication is not just the information element of, here's our new program, and here's how it works, and here are the policies and the forms and things you need to fill out or not, but it's also really around tips and training and providing support. Very few, less than a quarter of all American companies who launch an initiative like this support the initiative with any sort of training, which is just really puts you at a disadvantage, because how are you going to get employees and managers to be able to be comfortable with this new way of working if you're not training? And we'll talk about what the components of training that we recommend are in just a minute. Last is to create support activities for managers, and very, very few organizations do this. And we'll talk about what some of those look like as well, but they're low-cost, no-cost ways of encouraging conversation and dialogue and best practice sharing for both managers and employees. Again, that is really critical to changing that culture over time. And then lastly, we got to get really tactical. I come from a project management background, and it influenced this last point about scheduling and roadmaps. So many people need to be involved who have varied skill sets and opinions, and it's really helpful if you can get everybody on the same page, figure out when and where and how you're going to get started. Are you going to roll out individual pilots? Who is going to be selected for those pilots, and what are the selection criteria for doing so? And then ultimately, where and when and what you're going to measure.
All right, that's fantastic. So, at this point, let's, not forget a little extra time set up front in planning and design and development goes a long way towards increasing the likelihood of any project success, as we all know. So let's not shortchange, these first two phases. All right, so now we've developed the plan, and, we should be ready to put that plan into action with a pilot.
Sure. So as you embark on your pilot, you're going to see some of these same things repeated over and over again here, because these things are necessary steps in our process. The first step in your pilot is, of course, communication. You need to make sure that people understand what is going to be expected of them. How are you going to change the way they're working on a daily basis? You need to demonstrate to them that the organization is supportive of the change and embracing the change. As this pushes forward, you need to make sure that they understand, and be honest, obviously, in your communication. If this is being driven by cost savings measures, so this is a financially driven change, it's better to be upfront and let people know that, and also let them know what's in it for them. I worked with one customer who was very clear about that. They said, look, we're not competitive in our space anymore. We need to cut our costs. We don't want to move our facilities. We want to keep everybody employed. And this is one of the changes we have to make. And when people understand that kind of a communication, that's a pretty clear message to me anyway, that I would be embracing that change and wanting to help make that be successful. Next step in a pilot is back to the build out and physical change. And there's not a whole lot of changing here, but what I would look for is feedback about what works with your current facility, what doesn't work, what are the changes that you have to make, large scale, small scale, what are the changes that you have to make in order to be successful so that you can drive that change through the organization beyond the pilot. Because remember, the pilot is really about learning and learning the path forward for the change within your organization.
That is. Now remember, new construction is not a requirement, and in the pilot phase, it might make sense to actually put that off a while, right? We could learn something in the pilot about, the number of conference rooms we need, or breakout areas, or, how do I make sure when people are in the building that I'm getting that synergistic water cooler type effect that I want to get from that. Now that said, one thing I've often seen organizations not take into account at the pilot phase is limiting the amount of space that's available. Let's say we've now planned or set some goals around increasing our worker-to-workplace ratio. So traditionally today we're 1-to-1. Everyone gets their own desk. Our pilot metric says we're trying to get to 2-to-1. So you've got your pilot group of users, 100 out there. It's important that you think about limiting the inventory of space that's available to those 100 people. Again, if it's a real pilot and we're really trying to measure something, reduce the amount of workspaces available of those 100 employees and staff to 50. Get them in the use of hoteling, sharing desks, and those kinds of things. Lock some doors, turn off, lock a suite, shut down the floor, things like that. Things to take into consideration to make your pilot as positive as you can with that physical change.
Now, one of the other things that people need to think about, of course, is some of the technology that will be changing and being introduced with the pilot. And the technology, I really want to make sure everybody understands, the technology is an enabler of this. The technology can't make the change happen and can't make the change be successful. The technology is an enabler to help people along the way. It is necessary, particularly as you move to higher and higher ratios of people to desks, but it's not, technology is not the single answer to the question. So with that in mind, as I look at technology, particularly from a pilot, I'd like to look at it as being as easy, accessible, and effective as possible. And what that means is use technology that to the greatest extent possible takes advantage of actions people are already doing today. If you have turnstiles in your building and people are badging in and out, then you already have a mechanism of knowing when people arrive. Now, match that up to a reservation system so people are planning where they're going to be so they don't drive 40 minutes or an hour to the office and not find a desk, because that'll be that's a quick recipe for failure. You need to make sure that when people come into the office, they will be supported. And one of the best ways I've found to do that is through a reservation system. The alternative, of course, would be to have more space than you need, and that's what we're trying to get away from. So you match the turnstile to the reservation, and you have an easy check-in or presence event. You also want to make it accessible to people. You'll see that people will gravitate to different types of interfaces. Some people like kiosks, some people like smartphones, some people want to work on their iPad or their laptop, and that's all okay. The right technology solution will be able to catch people when and where they are with the technology that they want to use. And then finally, it's got to be effective and reliable. If it's not effective and reliable, and if it's not supporting the policies and procedures, then people simply will stop using it. You've got to keep all of these things in mind as you look at the technology that's in place to support the pilot. On the training side, this is similar to what we've talked about before, making sure that the training, people understand all three legs of the stool here. What are the technology implications that are going to be happening? What are the changes to the real estate policy of, how often should I come, their HR policy, how often should they come in, how often do they get to work from home, what are the rules when they're working from home, and so forth. And then on the real estate side, how is the workplace changing? Dave mentioned what spaces are available to me as a mobile worker, what spaces are not available to me, making sure that people have that information so they can make good decisions.
If you think about the value of a pilot, so let's take a step back just for a second. Why should I even do a pilot? You might have gotten clearance from senior leadership to just go, right, and do a full-scale rollout, which is fine. But what the pilot does is it gives you an opportunity to get some learnings under your belt, to figure out what needs to be adjusted so that you're ready for prime time. And some of the things that are going to come out in a pilot are things that you really might not have been able to anticipate. Just listening to the conversation around build-outs and changes in the actual physical workspace, that's fundamental. The old idea that, I got the corner office with the windows and the palm tree or the potted palm, that's big for people. And so when you're changing up their workspace or you're introducing new technology, someone might say, well, Kelly, why don't I'm just going to come in. What's the big deal? That's what I've always done my whole career. These are fundamental kind of almost primal changes to people that can be really threatening. And so a pilot gives you time and space for everybody to be able to air their concerns, their frustrations, and for you to learn what messaging is working well, what training approaches are working well. And there's a couple of other things I would add to training. One is you not only need to communicate what is changing and what the new procedures are, as Frank said, but you also want to help them with skills. One of the, I saw a recent survey last year, over 60% of people who become managers don't ever get formal training. And so now you're talking about having these managers train people that they can't see. And that opens up a floodgate of concerns and issues, opens up the potential weaknesses that we all have, that we know we need to shore up in our own management. Maybe I'm not very good at setting deadlines. Maybe I'm a little bit shy or introverted and I'm not the best communicator. Well, now all those things are going to come to a head because we're all going to be more exposed in terms of our skills for managing that. So helping managers really get their arms around strategies and tips and tools and advice for how do you communicate better? How are you going to keep that strong sense of team going as you're rolling this program out and really getting comfortable with virtual work? And then lastly, we also really encourage you to think about including in training what we call a virtual teams blueprint. The idea is it's a 7-point structure, so a 7-point document that creates a new structure where the old structure is melting away for how we're going to, as a team, interact with each other. What are the values and the behaviors that are really important that we uphold? How often are we going to answer email? How are we going to show each other that we're working? What technology are we going to be using to optimize meetings and team building exercises that we think would be fun and not hokey for our team?
That's right. And then, of course, after the training and you start to think about getting going, you have to start to think about how am I going to be supporting this team that's going through this pilot with you. And there are certain things in our experience together that we've learned you need to be ready for. Typically in a pilot, what we see are a lot of questions, how do I do this, how do I do that? You'll get some why questions. Remember the why questions, why are we doing this? Those need to be answered from the communication that we talked about at the beginning of this phase to address the why. In the daily support, you want to be thinking about the how questions. And be proactive. Provide FAQs to people so that they can look at them and understand, even before they begin, what would be expected in certain circumstances.
Yeah, and there's really nothing better than learning from each other. That how question is the sticky wicket. That's the challenge for everyone in the organization. After the basic fundamentals are laid out, the remaining question for years and years and years is the how. So if you can understand that, wrap your arms around that, and create strategies to help managers and employees answer that how, you're going to be light years ahead of other organizations, and you're really going to ensure success for your program based on that culture change that's going to happen. So how do you do that? First of all, if one manager hears some good tips or tools or advice, or if some managers or senior leaders get up in front of a whole group of people, maybe at a town hall or a departmental meeting, and they start talking about, I was really resistant to this. I really didn't know how we were going to make sure that work was still getting done, and here's my story. That goes so much farther than any corporate communication we could ever put together. Get managers talking to each other, talking to employees, all the way up and down the chain of command in your organization. Create communities. Those communities can be on-site, they can be virtual, they can be automated. So some organizations put together a virtual teams or a remote workers employee resource group. So just like they've got, you might have a working parents resource group, think about putting together a telework resource group. And you can put a forum out online where everybody can talk and exchange ideas and share frustrations, et cetera. And then lastly is share best practices and success stories. I can't say enough about how critical that is. The more learning that's taking place in the organization that can be shared with others, the more everybody understands, I don't have to be an expert at this. I just have to be open to making that change happen.
That's right. And then the last step in the pilot phase brings us back to the measurement. Because remember, as we're going through a pilot, we're going to be asked, we're going to be questioned, was the pilot a success? And going in, you have to have defined your metrics, your success criteria, so that you can address the question from senior leadership of should this program continue, should it go faster, should it go slower, and what needs to change. That's why those metrics are so important up front, because you will get this question, and you have to confirm to them that based on what we defined as our success criteria, this is our best path forward, whatever that path may be.
And to really ensure manager buy-in, help managers understand how to translate those big organizational metrics, those big success goals that you're striving for, help them figure out how to apply it to their own individual team. It's really a struggle. The managers that we work with on this kind of look at me dumbfounded when I first introduced this idea. They may care about turnover, but they may not care about profitability as much as they care about turnover, for example. Or they may be charged with quality assurance issues. And yeah, employee retention is important, but for them, they've got to be able to process through more pieces, or they've got to be able to improve processing time or response time, et cetera. So to the extent that you can help managers have those benchmarks be real for them, then they're going to start to see that this isn't just a program that is good for the employee or good for the organization, but that it's really a fundamental tool to help improve the effectiveness of their own team.
Oh man, all right, that's good stuff. So kind of to summarize, we're going to use that pilot phase to learn about our users, our organizational culture. We're going to start small, we're going to learn, and always be iterative to make adjustments. All right, so we've had a successful pilot, and we're ready to move on to a broader rollout.
So as we embrace the rollout phase, and this is really, people always want to get here, they want to start here sometimes. Obviously, there's necessary things that have to happen first. But as we embrace the rollout phase, I want to point out that you really need to wrap some method of what's called program management around this, because each individual facility or team or country, depending on how you're deploying, really is its own project. So that becomes something part of what's called a program management, so that you can look at the big picture of how things are progressing forward, making sure that you're moving all the pieces in harmony, because sometimes you have to share resources across these different projects. You've got technology that you have to consider for its deployment. You need to look at a big picture program management kind of view of what's happening to make sure that people are aware of what will be expected of them as they move forward. Additionally, you have to let people know on the headcount and on the budget side what the costs are. This is a question that we get quite a bit of, okay, so we're going to now introduce mobility or hoteling or telework in San Francisco. What does that mean to my cost structure if I'm the office manager? You need to let them know what percent of an FTE or how many hours per week you think the support team will need in order to make that program be successful in that office. And I'll reference again last month's webinar actually with our guest panelist who talked a lot about that, where they make a lot of investment in that team. That's the choices that they've made to support the model that they have. That works very well for them. You may choose to follow a model like that, or you may have less on-site support. Whatever it is, you have to go into it with your eyes open, understanding the choices you've made and what the impact of those choices might be for your program management.
It's really going to help you anticipate in advance the potential challenges that you're going to have with your program. It also really helps you then have the conversation when you're in the front end of rolling it out rather than putting out the crisis fires as you go through. Communication, it's the same way. You want to be really deliberate, like I said before, about your communication plan. Starting with, are you going to brand your program or not? And that's a very specific decision. There's no right or wrong answer based on the culture of your own organization. So some companies will brand every one of their initiatives. They've got their own logo. It may be a variation of the corporate logo. And so to launch another program, of course, it's got to have its own brand name and its own logo. For other organizations, they don't want it to feel like it's separate from the day-to-day dealings of their own business, and so they don't want to brand it because their goal ultimately is really to have this just be part of how and where and when people work in the organization. So you're going to want to make that decision. Also, you're going to want to work with your internal communications department. Depending on how much experience you have working with them, you may or may not realize what an incredible resource they are, not only to do some of the heavy lifting around the design of some of those materials, but also to help you align the messaging, your messaging of this initiative with the overall messaging of the organization. You're also going to want to think about what are the elements of the communication plan, and should those elements be printed. There's an organization we were talking with last week who shared the fact that they had to print plain old ordinary old-fashioned brochures because they wanted to hand them out to people as they were walking in the door in the morning, as opposed to an intranet site where there's all kinds of information, all the stuff we've been talking about today that's housed in one place. Or maybe you use online communities and it's more appropriate to put the information there. Certainly, as we already discussed, we want to make sure that we're taking the documentation, breaking it into those FAQs. It's so much easier to read through a list of question and answer than it is to go through a 40-page document. And then lastly, be really sensitive to, especially if this is a global initiative, what are the laws, because they vary by state sometimes and also by country. What are the local sensitivities? What are your internal cultural sensitivities to certain words? You're positioning things in a certain way. And just being sensitive to that. And again, that's where your communications department can really help.
And when you look at the technology in a rollout phase, the technology concerns here are very, very different from the pilot. The technology concerns for the rollout phase are how do you make sure that your centralized technology solutions are working across this now widely distributed rollout. And what we've done with several of our customers over time is developed methods of monitoring the technology as it's deployed in different places. For example, we talk a lot about the use of and value of a kiosk where people can walk into a building, they can see what space is available, they can find people, they can make bookings and so forth. So a kiosk is a great way to catch people as they're coming into a building and help them with some quick and easy transactions. However, if that kiosk isn't functional, that's a real black eye on the program, because then people start to associate that with the program itself not being useful and effective for what they're trying to do. So because these kiosks could exist all over the country or all over the world, what we want to do is look for ways of monitoring and making sure that they're available. So if the kiosk goes down in Denver, people could be alerted back in their data center on the East Coast long before anyone in Denver even knows about it. So that's the first, when people walk into the building, this is just, of course, one example, but the kiosk is the face of the system when people walk into the building, and you need to make sure that the technology choices you're making support that distributed model, that large-scale rollout, and really will drive the change that you want to make as you're moving throughout your organization.
So when you think about training, since you will have done some of this training in a pilot, now you want to adjust the messaging, the amount of time that you're offering the training. Is it an hour-long program? Is it a half-day program? Again, you're going to want to fit that into the training approaches and philosophies that your organization already uses. I would highly encourage you to think about different modes of training, because people learn in different ways. So best practice organizations offer training in a whole bunch of different formats to meet everybody's varied needs. So whether it's on-site workshops or offering the same content from an on-site workshop in a condensed webinar-based form, some organizations then will record those sessions and make them available for playback to anybody, and again are housing all of this information either on an intranet site or in an online community that's accessible internally. And then on-demand e-learning approaches that are available. And the nice thing is, and the idea, the best practice is to not just offer one, but you might offer on-demand e-training so that people with individual challenges can get the very pinpoint specific training that they need. And then an on-site workshop is going to offer the opportunity for managers really to get in and collaborate and talk together about some of their challenges and issues. And then again, as you're designing and rolling out training, especially globally, you're going to want to make sure that you're adjusting that training to the local sensitivities.
And another aspect of training that I'd point out is through your program now, you're developing and you're collecting data, and you're going to be turning that data into information. And don't forget that you need to talk back to what we sometimes call the operational teams or the strategic teams about what can you do with this data now? You've got this program in place. People are coming in, they're using the program, the workplace program, not the technology program, but you're collecting data about what's going on. And now, how do you turn that data into intelligence? And there's some training and understanding that's very necessary there, because if people, they need to understand what the data is telling them in order to make good decisions. We had a recent experience where people were asking a certain set of questions, but the data wasn't collected to support that set of questions. So we had to go back and try to reconcile with them about, okay, if this is what you're trying to do, then we need to collect this other type of data. So it's easy to think about training, or we often think about training as the people who are in the mobility program, but you also have to think about the consumers of the information that's coming out of the program. How are you going to train them and make sure you address their needs? And that leads right into support, which is how you need to make sure that you're supporting people across, again, those three legs, HR, IT, and real estate, so that as things continue to change, you're giving them the right support that they need as the change is taking place in your organization.
And thinking about support as you roll out, in a pilot, you're not going to launch every type of support activity possible. You might get the team together to do a brown bag lunch and share best practices, concerns, issues, solutions that arose in the pilot. But now, as in the rollout, you've got the opportunity. You're going to have some economies of scale. So now you've got the opportunity to invest in some things. Like I said, maybe you build an online forum, or you start to invest in an employee resource group that goes beyond just the headquarters to extending out to the rest of the country or the world. The other thing is, just like with training, layering different modes of training is really effective. I'd also encourage you to think about layering different types of support. So you might do video conference calls. You may do traditional conference calls where you're getting managers on the phone to talk to each other. You may offer some conference calls with an expert on how to set up a home office environment that's ergonomically correct, if that's a concern for you, or that's safe, so that you're limiting your liability there. And you can do lunch and learns. You can do lunch and learns on site. You can host virtual coffees where employees are getting together and just talking about the pluses and minuses of these sorts of programs. You can encourage a team that's struggling or that's really embracing this and growing quickly to go off on a team retreat to work together to understand their work-life styles, their individual work styles, their preferences, and really get them cooking on all cylinders, firing on all cylinders so that they can really be optimizing this way of working. And then lastly, when you think about measurement, we'd encourage you to think about building a feedback loop between those metrics that are important for senior leadership and the metrics that have been important for individual teams. By now, you should have some good data points about how some individual teams have been able to improve their metrics, and just communicating that success story does a couple things. First of all, it communicates the success. Second of all, it piques the curiosity and imagination of other managers about how their peers have been able to get those achievements, those metrics, those benchmarks to be able to move. That starts to get energy. The more your managers who are not embracing the program are seeing the results of managers and departments that are embracing the program, the more your program starts to be a pull, where managers are saying, hey, I got to get on board, this is awesome, as opposed to a push where you are the ones who are primarily pushing the information and encouraging the adoption of this program. Also, one last thing is just on the issue of qualitative versus quantitative metrics. So many times we think about hard-edged metrics when we're thinking about how to measure the success of a program. Sometimes some organizations are perfectly happy to use self-reported metrics. I feel more productive. I feel more connected. And if that works for your organization or for your individual managers, then that's just fine too.
All right, great. So as we've discussed, this is not a typical big bang scenario. We want to roll this kind of program out in a manageable way over the workforce. And with that, let's move on to the last slide and talk about the management and culture change phases of the rollout.
So one of the things that happens to organizations is that the fire starts to go out a little bit. Let's say your initial goal was to reduce your leases, and now you've achieved this multi-million-dollar savings. What's to get people excited and committed and motivated in year 3 or 4 when the memory of those millions of dollars of real estate savings are starting to fade? It's important then to continue that feedback loop between you, your steering committee, the 3 legs of the stool, HRIT, and real estate, and to be engaging in an ongoing conversation with senior leadership so that you are not, that this program doesn't just fall by the wayside over time or that the enthusiasm dies down. Only 7% of organizations in this country, based on a survey that came out last year, only 7% of organizations continue to measure the ROI of their programs after the initial rollout. And if you think back to the very beginning, what was the very first thing we talked about? The business case. So you sold the program in on the business case, and now we're falling short on the metrics and measurement. That leaves you vulnerable for a senior leadership change to have the program fall by the wayside or be questioned in terms of the overall value that it's offering. Communication continues to be important, and what can be exciting after you've been working this communication strategy for a while is to start thinking about how do you target individual groups within your organization to encourage their support and their utilization of the program. So you might start really customizing your messaging for baby boomers that are thinking about retiring and the advantages of this program to them. You might start thinking about caregivers in your organization and how they can be benefiting from these sorts of programs.
And on the technology side, as we're going through the management and culture phases, you need to be ready for things to continue to change. Technology never stands still. It will continue to change. And what you may see in your organization, as we're seeing right now in several organizations, people are going to start voting with their feet. Well, what does that mean? The organization might have said, we're going to use BlackBerries for our phones, but everybody in the office is carrying an iPhone. Well, people have voted. And you need to have a program in place that is ready to embrace those changes, taking advantage, again, of the way people want to work so that you're not restricting them or inhibiting them. You're really enabling them to work the way that they want to work. And technology is a great way to do that, to use it as a platform to catch those changes and show that you're thinking about how they want to interact. Additionally, technology can help drive training. Training, just like everything else, is a continuing process. And as technology changes, as other things change, you have to keep circling back. It's not the same thing that it was in a pilot phase or a rollout phase. It's much more targeted. You can use tools within the technology to deliver that communication very often, but don't think that people don't need training, because people do. People need training on a continuing basis because the way they work will continue to change, the technology that they use will continue to change, and your program goals may change over time. So you need to keep that loop in place so that you can continue to help your people evolve with you.
I think the last 2 points I'd make on this slide are this. One is that, in fact, yesterday in the training I was doing with managers, a lot of them were working on global teams, and if they didn't understand the technology, whether it was a Connect community or whether it was SharePoint or whether it was their web meeting software, you know, some of this stuff seems so basic for us if we're using those that technology regularly, even things like instant messenger, and yet to managers who are so bogged down with the day-to-day, they may or may not even have a full understanding of how to utilize those programs, let alone the hoteling software and pulling reports and all of the other things that you may be offering them the opportunity to do. So more and more I'm hearing managers really requesting training on very specific aspects of technology, and that's just so easy to offer them, but I think a lot of times it's overlooked. And then in terms of support, I really think you've got the opportunity now to target the specific needs of different groups and to understand how the needs of IT around virtual working may be very different than sales, how managers and departments that are interacting with global teams may not only need help with how to manage virtual teams, but also cultural sensitivity training, helping them understand how to build relationships across borders. And so you really, by this point, have an opportunity to continue to evolve and really differentiate that training.
All right. That's great. That said, any successful program, you need to be listening, looking for feedback, and continually making iterative changes over time. That said, I know we've taken up a lot of the hour, but we'd love for everyone to stick around, and we're going to do a little question and answer. Doug? Doug, do we have you there? There we go.
I heard someone fall off the call, so it might have been Doug, as a matter of fact. Ashley, are you there that you have questions that you could tee up for us, or should we go ahead and just launch that ourselves? All right. Very possible.
Maybe we lost the whole office there.
We're working virtually.
Right.
Well, why don't we just ask attendees, if you'd like to stay on, to go ahead and enter some questions into chat. What do you think, Dave?
I'm up for the challenge. While those questions come in, I'll at least sort of broadly, make up a question and answer, because I hear this all the time, which is, when it comes to these telework hoteling programs, everyone wants to know what the right answer is, right? And there absolutely is no right answer for any one organization. We've touched on it, whether it's, do I need concierges or not? Do I need an on-site person to support hoteling in every individual office? For some people that, culturally, that's what some organizations want to do, want to budget for. Others, there's a single point of contact in corporate headquarters that manages the program across the entire portfolio. Sometimes it's, what's the perfect worker-to-workplace ratio? There isn't one. Some organizations where cost and they're in a very competitive environment, they're going to drive a worker-to-workplace ratio of 8-to-1, 10-to-1, regardless of how that affects users. Other organizations are going to say, we're moving to this not only to support our staff, but we want to align our portfolio so that we're not wasting space by having it just sit there unused. We want to align the portfolio to be exactly the right size for staff. And then the last point I'm going to make there is, if you make a pool of spaces available, and you measure and you develop a plan. Hoteling doesn't mean people have to work at home or have to work at Starbucks or all these other places. What it means is you're making the appropriate amount of space available for people that need to come to the office. Some of your workers are going to want to continue to come to the office every day, and that's great if that works for them. Maybe they've got 7 roommates. Maybe they're just not interested in working from home and they want to make that commute every day. So whether it's an employee who wants to come in once a week or once a month, or whether it's an employee who comes in every day, hoteling for a lot of organizations is just making sure you've got a portfolio of space available when it makes sense. I also think we've got Torrance and Doug back if you've got some questions
here, Dave,
for the group.
We've got quite a few questions queued up already. This is the point that I would ask everybody who has a question for the panel to go ahead and use the WebEx Q&A facility to type up your question, and we'll address them as quickly as we can in the order they came in. To answer the kind of simple questions up front, we will have the recording and the slides available, so keep an eye out for your in-mail box or maybe your junk box, your junk email box, as we will be sending out the links to get to all that. We also have the resources that Kira was talking about earlier, some of the actions in the 15 errors slides. So the very first question we have here is, how do you manage entitlements and policies once you're doing AWS? And Torrance, perhaps you can answer that?
Yeah, sure. This question, everybody struggles with this question, and it's a little bit different in every organization because the culture of entitlements is very tied very often to the identity of the organization. There are a couple ways to help work through this. First off, if you remember back at the beginning of the conversation where we talked about the executive leadership has got to embrace this change. Very often they've got to participate in the change. Now, does that mean they'll participate the same way that a staff person will? Probably not, but they have to participate to the level that's appropriate for their rank in the organization. The other piece that I'd mentioned, and I mentioned this a little bit when I was going through the slides, is very often these changes are associated with kind of a compelling event for change. Everyone who's been through change management training knows that to make change happen, you need to have a reason to change, really. And that change, the reason can come from a lot of different ways. And if people understand that this is for the health of the organization so that they can keep working where they work, they can keep receiving the paycheck that they're receiving, that's pretty strong motivation. Will it get everybody? No, but that goes back to the communication to help drive the message of why we're doing this to push this through. Entitlement, real issue, real concern, and you do have to address it head on or you won't get buy-in.
This is Kira. I just wanted to add on really briefly that studies have shown that if senior leaders do not do not model the behavior, then the rest of the organization becomes very leery or skeptical about whether or not it's okay to work in these new ways. So part of addressing entitlement and equity and all those other sorts of issues that come up here is really that part of your role in launching a program is to encourage senior management, senior leadership to be the change they want to happen in their organization.
Wonderful answers. Okay, so the next question we have here in the queue is, have you done a successful program without a pilot?
This is Kira. Yes, I've seen organizations do successful programs without pilots. What it means is they're learning as they go. There's one organization I'm thinking in particular that they were in on a phone call where a bunch of other organizations were sharing their communication strategies and plans and tools. And partway through on that call, the project lead realized that the decision they had made about not branding the program maybe wasn't the right one because of some of the challenges they were having. So that would just be one example. You're learning while doing, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means that you've got to be managing expectations and implementing change on the fly as you go, and you need to have senior leader support in order to do that.
And I would add just to that, look at the scale of the change they're making. If your change is evolutionary, not revolutionary, then you may be able to move and a little fast forward there and not go through the pilot learning process, because remember, a pilot really is for learning. If your change is a little more on the revolutionary scale, then I really would caution you to step back and think long and hard about skipping the pilot phase, because the change, getting this right is important. You don't want to misfire on it. So look at the scale of your change, kind of map it on evolution versus revolution, and then think about your next steps forward.
Excellent. Now, there was another question up next from the pilot slide, and they were asking, can you provide some concrete examples of what you meant by an action plan for team effectiveness?
Torrance, is that me or is that you?
That one's you.
Okay, so some very large organizations have an actual team effectiveness model or an approach through training, through organizational development for how they help teams build team effectiveness. And so what I would suggest is that you align your training to fit whatever models about team effectiveness you already have in place. That's one way to answer the question. The other interpretation of that question is I'm talking about it maybe what I meant when I said a virtual teams blueprint. The components of a virtual teams blueprint are really what are the communication strategies that you and your team are going to use? How are you going to manage and monitor performance? what are the team building and culture translation activities that you're going to make sure, so if you're doing Tuesday birthday parties and you're going to have to abandon Tuesday birthday parties, how are you going to translate that to virtual culture? How are you going to optimize technology? How are you going to redesign work process? And then lastly, how are you going to build a document we call a virtual teams agreement that expresses very explicitly what values and behaviors every one of your team members is going to agree to, so that you don't have to be guessing or assuming about why someone thinks that a conference call is optional, or that you've got a couple team members who aren't as available as everybody thought they would be. So hopefully that gives a little bit more dimension.
Excellent. The next question here is, can you use network usage data from the IT group? And Torrance or Dave maybe can answer that?
Sure, I'll go ahead and take that one. So yes, you can. And you know, often whether we call it a check-in or a presence event, it's really, that piece of information is a critical component to the success of a hoteling program, towards its measurement, and really to drive utilization. It's not enough to just book a space. It's important to know that it gets used. So whether that's a kiosk, whether it's using the network as well, or honestly whether it's a security access control system, those are all valid check-in events and ones that we've succeeded with a number of customers. When it does come to the network, of course, like with even security card access, we do need to get the support and participation of the the IP network team.
Excellent. The next question we have here is, how do you address the perceived takeaway that comes from giving up assigned space?
So I'll go first, Karen, and then you can add on, Torrance. That's a really, it's an interesting question about that, and it's a little bit back to the entitlement point. And what we've seen over time, and we've been doing this now for 15 years, is people have already decided to work differently than their office space is designed. So people have already decided, when you look around, that when they come into the office, they're going to be working in a more collaborative way. When they have to do highly focused work, they're going to work perhaps in a different place where they're not going to be distracted. So they're going to choose the work setting already that best suits the way they want to work. And programs like this, really, the issue is that we're not saying take things away from people. We're saying give people what they need when and where they need it. If you need a big office on a certain day because you have to impress somebody, fine. If you want a collaborative space because you're doing highly interactive design work, that's great too. The answer is really one size doesn't fit all. The cube or office that people are in right now isn't designed to support the way people need to work. And these solutions are much more about aligning the space with the need. I understand there's going to be an emotional reaction to you're taking my space away. It goes back to the entitlement question. And I'm going to pull that conversation back to what I was talking about before with the personal ROI and making sure people understand what's in it for them so that they know why the change is happening, what the benefits to that person is as an individual, so they can be more effective and productive in getting their work done.
This is Kira. I would just add two things. One is people want to be heard. Give them an opportunity to express in a positive way, but also, privately, let them express their frustration or concerns or fears about this. This is a big, big change, and it goes a long way just to have employees feel like they can be heard. That's the first thing. The second thing is this is a marketing problem. This is a communications challenge. Make sure that the way you're positioning this is authentic. Make sure that you're being honest about the reasons for this change, and really position this about the benefits to them. They're not losing something, they're gaining something. They're able to work in ways that are more better suited to their own life, to their own priorities, to their own work styles, to the times in the day that they're most productive.
Excellent. And the next question is, if there were an optimal floor plan for a hoteling office, what would it look like? For example, what would the ratio of private space to collaborative space to touchdown space be?
So that's a great question, and if anybody out there has a silver bullet, I'd love to hear it. But the real answer is you need to understand the people who are working in the space and the type of work they do. There are organizations that have been doing this for a long time, and I'll use IBM as an example, that have very, very detailed metrics about the type of work the person does and the business unit they're in, and that gives them the ratios they need for how many workspaces are necessary for the number of workers that are there. And their ratios, by the way, are extremely aggressive. I've seen up to almost 20 to 1 in their ratios. So it's not, there isn't one perfect floor plan that's going to fit all. You really need to look at the work patterns and the work that's being done in the office in order to come up with the floor plan that best suits the people who are working there.
Terrific. I think the next question is probably aimed right at Kira. How many companies are doing manager training on flexible work, and do you know if there is a beneficial impact to that training? Has it been demonstrated or documented through research or metrics?
Very, very, very great question. Very interesting question. So first of all, in terms of, let me take the second part first. There's a study of a researcher from Michigan State University named Ellen Koffek, K-O-F-F-E-K, did a research study around training for retail supervisors, if you can imagine. And she was able to prove through that research that those supervisors, after receiving flexibility training, were much more supportive. Their teams worked better. Their employees, they retained their employees longer. Morale went up, etc. So that's one. The other is we're actually currently in a study, Life Meets Work, Boston College Center for Work and Family, and Career Life Alliance Services. We're in the middle of a study to do exactly that, to prove out that through a combination of training and manager support, that we can change the attitudes and change the culture of those teams in the process. So stay tuned for those results in the later in 2012. The other, yeah, well, I was going to say the first part of the question is there is, if you look up that survey on workplace flexibility from World at Work, if you Google that, you'll find that survey, and in that survey they report the results of how many best practice companies train their managers and employees and how many of just regular organizations train. But it's, I think in the very best case, it was, I'm going to guess 36, 37%, I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, and on the low end only about in the low 20s trained. So the vast majority of organizations do not.
Excellent answer, thanks. Well, we've got just one last question here we have time for before we're going to close. The question is, we've currently got a lot of hotelers that'll book space but not actually show up to use it. How do you police this, and how do you ensure that people release this space?
So, Doug, I'll take that. It speaks right to the heart of hoteling and something that we sometimes call a check-in or presence event. Without that presence event, a hoteling system or a reservation system is really no more accurate than a calendaring system. And everybody knows that calendaring systems aren't the best way of measuring and understanding what's happening. So when you do have that presence event, whether it's a check-in on the hoteling system, a network presence event, a security card, or what have you, you can get reports back. And in our case, of course, at AgileQuest, we have reports that are pre-built to show you who made bookings and didn't come up, so that you can identify the offenders and take action by addressing things with them. Additionally, the system is proactive. And if the person does not arrive by a certain period of time, the system will go ahead and free their space up and make it available for others. So it automatically bumps them out of that space. There are some futures that we're looking at so that people have to positively confirm their use of the space the day before, for example. We've had people ask about that, so that they have to say, yes, I'm coming tomorrow, and if not, then they lose their space. But it is an issue, and the best way to address it is using a presence event freeing up the space when they don't come, and having the information to go back to them to address the offenders and modify their behavior.
I think that answer was probably perfect. Well, we've run out of time here, and I'd like to thank Kira Cavanaugh from Life Meets Work, as well as Torrance Houlihan and Dave Sauty from here at AgileQuest. Thanks also to all of you who joined us today for your excellent questions. Remember, the slides and recording will be available soon, so please watch your inbox for an email with the links. And the resources will also be on, there will also be information there on next month's webinar. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon from AgileQuest.